The temperature in the Helmand River Valley at 030 hours in January sits at -7 degrees Celsius, not the killing cold of the Hindu Kush, but cold enough to slow thought, stiffen fingers, and persuade a body that warmth is somewhere else and movement is the enemy. The ground is compacted mud and frost-hardened scrub that crunches underfoot unless you have been trained, at length and with considerable suffering, to place each boot as though the earth itself might detonate. The sky is a black sheet with no ambient light for 40 kilometers in any direction. There is no drone overhead, no GPS-linked strike package preloaded and waiting, no quick reaction force staged 8 minutes back, just 8 men, in full fighting order, moving through the dark toward a compound that military intelligence has assessed as holding a significant Taliban command element. A compound that a US company of over 100 men had attempted to clear 3 weeks earlier and pulled back from after taking casualties and encountering resistance described in the after-action report as beyond the capacity of the assigned force to neutralize. 8 men. The same compound. The same Taliban. A different result. This is not a story about recklessness or luck or the convenient Hollywood mythology of the lone warrior who walks into danger because he has nothing left to lose. This is a story about a system. A grinding, brutal, deliberate system of selection and preparation that has been producing a specific kind of human being for over 350 years, in a training establishment on the South Devon coast of England, where roughly 70% of the men who begin the journey never finish it. A system so demanding that NATO allies, who have sent observers to watch it, describe what they saw with language that is difficult to distinguish from disbelief. The United States Marine Corps is, by any reasonable measure, among the finest military organizations in human history. Their training is longer and more technically sophisticated than almost any comparable program in the world. Their combat record across 2 world wars, Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf, Iraq, and Afghanistan, is written in blood and documented in institutional legend. American Marines do not impress easily. They are trained not to, which is why a statement made by a U.S. Marine officer who served alongside the Royal Marines in Helmand Province during Operation Herrick carries the specific gravity it does. He had watched 8 Royal Marine commandos accomplish in a single night what his company had not been able to accomplish in 3 weeks of sustained effort. When asked later what he remembered most about that operation, he said he didn't have the language for it, that it wasn't about tactics or equipment or firepower, that it was something else, something he had been trained not to believe existed. That something else has a name. It has an address. It has a selection course that runs for 32 weeks in the rain and mud of the Devon moors, and a set of physical standards that remain unchanged regardless of how many men they destroy in the attempt. It is called the Royal Marines Commando course, and what it produces is not a soldier with better gear or a more sophisticated doctrine. What it produces is a man who has been systematically dismantled and rebuilt, whose relationship with fear, exhaustion, cold, pain, and failure has been fundamentally rewired over the better part of a year, and who goes to war carrying everything that survival requires in a burden weighing close to 30 kilograms, trusting not in technology but in the man beside him and the thing that was put inside him on the moors. If that kind of story matters to you, if the gap between what gets remembered and what actually happened is something you find worth closing, subscribing to this channel is how you make sure the next one reaches you. The stories we cover don't find their way into the headlines by accident. Someone has to go looking for them. To understand what happened in Helmand Province across nearly a decade of British deployment, to understand why American officers wrote in their reports what they wrote, why Taliban commanders issued specific warnings about particular sectors, why the most extraordinary small unit combat achievements of the modern era were buried under the weight of political management and institutional silence. You have to go back before Afghanistan. You have to go back to the beginning of the machine. The Lord High Admiral's regiment was raised on the 28th of October 1664, by order in council of King Charles II. Their purpose was to serve aboard Royal Navy ships of the line as soldiers, to repel boarders, lead raiding parties ashore, and act as the lethal edge of maritime power projection at a time when Britain's global reach depended on controlling the sea. They were, from their first day of existence, not garrison troops. They were assault troops. Men whose entire operational purpose was to go somewhere they were not expected, arrive at a time of their own choosing, accomplish something violent and decisive, and leave before the enemy could organize a response. The logic of the Royal Marines has never changed in 350 years. Only the geography has. By the time of the Falklands War in 1982, the Royal Marines had accumulated a combat record spanning virtually every environment on Earth: Arctic, jungle, mountain, amphibious, urban, and had developed a training philosophy that reflected not the institutional preference for standardized competence, but an almost theological insistence on the kind of individual resilience that no amount of equipment or procedure can substitute for. The Commando course at Commando Training Centre Royal Marines in Lympstone, Devon, is not the most physically demanding initial military training program in the world by every metric, but it is the longest infantry initial training program in NATO, and by a margin that is not close, 32 weeks. Against the 13 weeks of U.S. Army basic training, against the 13 weeks of the U.S. Marine Corps recruit training pipeline, those extra weeks are not additional tactical instruction. They are something more fundamental, an extended process of psychological attrition designed not to identify men who are already resilient, but to make men resilient, to install through accumulated misery and deliberate challenge at every threshold a new relationship between the man and his own limits. The Commando tests that end the course are 4 events in sequence at the tail of a pipeline that has already taken almost everything from the man who reached them. The endurance course, 6 miles of tunnels, wading pools, and Devon moorland obstacles in a target time of 73 minutes, followed immediately by a marksmanship assessment to be passed with a weapon fired through a body that has just been pushed to physiological extremity. The Tarzan assault course, the 9 miles speed march in full fighting order in 90 minutes, and the 30-miler, 30 miles across open Dartmoor in 8 hours, in full fighting order, carrying a rifle, navigating by map and compass, with no electronic assistance of any kind. These are not the whole story. They are the final chapter of 32 weeks that include open water swimming, cliff assault, close quarter battle in the killing house, section attacks, company attacks, survival exercises, and every prior night in a wet sleeping bag in a shallow scrape in the Dartmoor mud. The pass rate across the full course sits historically at approximately 25 to 30%. That means the training pipeline itself, before anyone has stepped into a combat zone, destroys roughly 70% of the men who attempt it. Officers fail at a similar rate. The Green Beret is not issued. It is earned, and the word earned carries freight here that it does not carry in most contexts. What this produces, operationally, is not a super soldier in the Hollywood sense. Royal Marine Commandos are not physiologically extraordinary beings. They are not faster or stronger than the men who failed the course by some genetic margin. What distinguishes them is something less visible and more durable: a settled relationship with discomfort that most human beings spend their entire lives avoiding. The man who has spent 32 weeks being systematically cold, wet, hungry, sleep-deprived, and pushed beyond what he believed possible, and who has chosen each time to continue rather than quit, has been altered at a level below conscious awareness. Fear is still present. Pain is still real, but neither governs the decision in the way they govern the decisions of men who have not been through the same process. This is the machine that arrived in Helmand province, Afghanistan, in the spring of 2006, and the Taliban, who had spent years watching American-style high-tempo operations defined by firepower, technology, and a structural preference for standoff engagement, did not immediately understand what they were dealing with. They learned. Helmand province in 2006 was not the war that anyone had planned for. The British decision to deploy 3 Commando Brigade into what was meant to be a development-led mission was accompanied by political confidence that is now almost incomprehensible to read back. John Reid, the Secretary of State for Defence, expressed the famous hope that British troops could complete their mission without firing a shot. The statement reflected genuine institutional optimism. It was wrong in a way that the men who arrived in theatre understood immediately, and that Whitehall took considerably longer to process. Helmand province in 2006 was a Taliban stronghold of such department and organizational sophistication that the limited NATO forces committed to it were outnumbered in key districts by a factor that would have alarmed any operational planner given honest intelligence rather than the sanitized assessments that flowed upward through coalition planning layers. The Helmand River Valley runs north to south through some of the most tactically difficult terrain in the country, The green zone's dense agricultural irrigation channels, poppy fields, and mud-walled compounds flanked by open desert where movement could be observed from kilometers away and where the summer heat exceeded 50 degrees Celsius in direct sun. The Taliban's fighting force in Helmand was not an insurgent rabble by 2006. It was organized, experienced, and increasingly sophisticated. An entity that had been fighting continuously for years, that knew the ground with an intimacy no foreign force could match, and that had developed tactical responses to the American way of war with a pragmatic intelligence its enemies consistently underestimated. They knew the targeting cycle. They knew how long it took from the initiation of an engagement to the arrival of close air support. They knew the limits of ISF forces' willingness to accept casualties, and they had a clear picture of what the foreign force looked like when it was operating within its comfort zone. Technology-dependent, reluctant to move at night on foot for extended periods, reliant on vehicle-mounted firepower and the protective logic of force protection that produces predictable patterns. The British arrived and behaved differently. Not always, and not without the equipment shortfalls that became a national scandal. Inadequate vehicles, insufficient helicopter assets, body armor that was not fully adequate for the threat. But within those shortfalls, a force operated that the Taliban had not encountered before in quite this form. A force that moved at night. A force that patrolled on foot across distances that other coalition elements found implausible. A force that occupied compounds in the middle of enemy-held districts and held them for weeks and months against sustained assault, with supply lines so tenuous that resupply sometimes arrived by helicopter because no ground route was viable. Now ZAD was the first education. A collection of buildings in a town almost entirely evacuated by its civilian population was held by L Company, 42 Commando Royal Marines, in the summer and autumn of 2006, against Taliban forces who at their peak launched coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The position was isolated. The green zone flanked it on approaches that were mined and ambushed. The perimeter was under observation from Taliban firing points that could not always be suppressed without close air support that was not always available. The company held, not because they had superior firepower, not because relief was imminent. They held because the men inside that perimeter had been selected and trained to hold under exactly these conditions. Men for whom the question of whether to continue was not a calculation but a settled conclusion, reached months earlier on a Devon moor at 030 in the rain, under the supervision of a training staff that had heard every version of the case for stopping and remained entirely unmoved by all of them. Sangin was the confirmation. The district centre at Sangin, held through 2006 and into 2007 by rotating British units, paratroopers, Royal Marines, infantry, was the bloodiest single district of the Afghan war for ISF forces, and became, in the institutional memory of the Taliban, associated with a quality of British resistance that their own commanders began to document in terms that were operational warnings rather than propaganda. The Taliban's internal assessment of British forces in Helmand was not a uniform. Different units, different rotations, different commanders produced different results, as is true of any military force across 9 years of sustained combat. But the specific assessment of Royal Marine Commandos was distinctive. Former Taliban fighters and commanders interviewed by journalists and researchers in the years following the British withdrawal have described a consistent awareness of when the unit in a district had changed, based not on intelligence but on behavior, on the way the patrols moved, on the hours they chose, on the distances they covered, on the specific failure of approaches that had worked against the previous unit. The Taliban had a tactical vocabulary for this. When you tried the pattern ambush, the IED on the route they always used, the dawn attack when the previous unit had been at its lowest alert state, it didn't work, because the new unit wasn't using the same route, wasn't predictable at dawn, wasn't operating in the register the Taliban had mapped and planned against. As Patrick Bishop noted in his reporting from the period, Taliban fighters described specific frustration with British foot patrols that moved through terrain assessed as impassable in darkness without electronic navigation, terrain that any vehicle-dependent force would have avoided, that any force reliant on GPS would have moved through slowly and noisily. The Royal Marines moved through it at full operational tempo. Night navigation training on the Devon moors, conducted at the beginning of the pipeline rather than the end, had installed the capability as a baseline rather than a specialty. The word used in several accounts from Taliban fighters to describe the British ground force was one that acknowledged a category of enemy they had not previously encountered from the foreign coalition. Men who fought the way a skilled guerrilla force fights. Patient, low signature. Night adapted. Capable of carrying everything they needed without resupply for periods that most forces would have found operationally paralyzing. Not powerful in the way of a B-1 billion bomber or a JTAC-controlled Hellfire strike, but skilled in a way that cannot be countered by the same tactics that absorb and bleed a more powerful but less adaptable enemy. Power can be bled. Skill is harder to counter because it adapts. Operation Sunchara launched on the 15th of December, 2008. The objective was the retaking of Musa Kuala, the largest population center in Helmand under Taliban administration, a command and logistics node, and a standing advertisement for the Taliban's ability to hold territory against NATO. The retaking was overdue, and the Taliban in Musa Kuala had prepared for it. Their firing points were registered. Their defensive positions were laid. They had done what an experienced force does when it knows an assault is coming and has time to prepare. What they had not fully accounted for was the specific nature of the assault. Elements of 42 Commando Royal Marines, operating alongside one Royal Irish Battle Group and Afghan National Army units, moved through the pre-dawn in foot mobile order through terrain that vehicle-borne forces could not traverse, arriving at positions the Taliban had assessed as protected by distance and darkness. The Royal Marines moved with the controlled silence that is a product not of natural talent but of months of low-light fieldcraft training, where the habits are installed precisely because in the real environment the consequence of noise is not a failed exercise, but a bullet. They navigated by compass. They carried what they needed and nothing more. The clearance of Musa Kuala took several days of sustained fighting that was not clean in the way that briefing rooms are clean. There were moments of fierce resistance, fighting in rooms and corridors at ranges measured in meters, Taliban fighters who chose to die in place. There were casualties, and there were moments, documented in participant accounts and journalistic coverage, where the Royal Marines' ability to operate continuously, without the performance degradation that sustained close combat typically induces in units without their specific preparation, produced the decisive difference between forward progress and stalemate. Operation Panchai Palang, Panther's Claw, launched in June 2009, involved elements of Task Force Helmand, including Royal Marines and 2nd Battalion the Rifles, in one of the most ambitious air assault operations British forces had conducted since the Falklands. The objective was the canal zone of central Helmand, a Taliban transit and fighting corridor that used the irrigation network's deep channels, mined tracks and loopholed compound walls as a natural defensive system. The fighting lasted weeks. The tactical problems were the same problems that had characterized every Helmand engagement. IEDs on every approach, compound clearances in close, the daily management of probability in an environment designed by the enemy to make probability work against you. A U.S. Army Special Forces officer assigned as liaison to Task Force Helmand during this period, a man whose own selection and qualification pipeline is one of the most demanding in the American military, described watching Royal Marines small unit leaders in the canal zone operate with a quality he framed in professional terms that were unusual in their specificity. The corporals and sergeants were making tactical decisions at a speed and standard he had not previously observed in a comparable peer force. They were not waiting for officer direction in situations where officer direction was not available because the officer was behind a different wall or in a different compound. They were deciding, executing, and adapting with a professional authority that reflected a level of preparation and genuinely delegated tactical competence that he described as structurally different from what he had been trained in. He attributed it to the preparation pipeline. What the 32-week course produces, he said, is not better tactics. It is a man for whom the decision is already made before the situation demands it. Stories like this one were classified, delayed, and filtered through institutional communication layers for years before the accounts of participants and embedded journalists made them accessible to the public record. If you're here because you believe the record of what these men actually did deserves to be complete and audible, Subscribing to this channel is how you ensure we keep pulling these accounts into the light. The concentrated body of documented American and Allied reaction to Royal Marines' performance in Helmand does not come from a single event. It accumulates across 9 years of deployment through the accounts of embedded journalists, liaison officers, and the official after-action reports that NATO headquarters generated on force effectiveness across the alliance. General Stanley McChrystal, who commanded ISAF from June 2009 to June 2010, was not a man who distributed professional compliments casually. His military career Delta Force, Joint Special Operations Command, the architect of the targeting network that dismantled al-Qaeda in Iraq, had given him a calibration for elite performance that was as demanding as any in the alliance. His private assessments of British force quality in Helmand, as reported by journalists and staff officers who worked in his headquarters, were specifically and consistently positive, in a way that went beyond the diplomatic generalities that Allied commanders exchange for institutional courtesy. The British units in Helmand were performing at a level that the alliance as a whole could not match, and that the American force, configured for power projection through abundance rather than austerity, was not structured to replicate. This is not a comfortable observation. It is a documented one. A U.S. Marine Corps officer who served in Helmand and subsequently published in a professional military journal framed the comparison without diplomatic hedging. The Royal Marines' 32-week Commando course produces something that the USMC, with its broader manpower requirements and the institutional mathematics of volume training, has not replicated. Not because the USMC lacks the will or the capability to produce elite infantry, because the scale at which it must operate makes the specific preparation pipeline that produces the Commando an institutional impossibility at volume. What Limestone does is choose, from the population of men who begin the course, the specific 25 to 30% who cannot be broken. Then it breaks them anyway, at a deeper level, and rebuilds them. The comparative framework, the side-by-side analysis of what made Royal Marine performance distinctive in Helmand, requires acknowledging something that neither military establishment advertises. The difference between the U.S. Marine Corps combat soldier and the Royal Marine Commando is not a difference of courage or intelligence or tactical sophistication. Both institutions produce men of extraordinary professional quality. The difference is in what a 32-week selection-based attrition pipeline does to a man's internal relationship with his own limits, compared to what a 13-week standardized training program does, however rigorous that program is by every other measure. American observers in Helmand consistently noted one specific quality in Royal Marines that does not appear in official after-action reports, but recurs in personal accounts. The maintenance of performance standards in the operational middle period, the grinding 60th and 70th day of a deployment after the initial adrenaline has been spent and before the psychological relief of redeployment. The route variation, the patrol alertness, the tactical discipline that degrades in most forces as familiarity produces complacency, these were maintained in commando units at levels that suggested the habits were structural rather than motivated. Not because individual Royal Marines were immune to fatigue or fear or the psychological weight of sustained combat, but because the Commando course was itself a 32-week simulation of this middle operational period, and what it installed was calibrated specifically for it. The humor. In almost every American account of Royal Marines in the field, the humor is noted, consistently, with a mixture of admiration and genuine puzzlement. A U.S. Army officer, attached to a Royal Marines company, described watching a corporal take a burst of small arms fire 2 meters to his left, pause for 3 seconds, and then redirect a 2-man fire team through a compound doorway, with a kind of flat, unhurried authority associated with men who have done the same thing 1,000 times. And then make a comment that his section found briefly, blackly funny. The officer said it took him several days to understand that the register was not denial or bravado. The corporal was not pretending the situation wasn't dangerous. He had processed danger at a different level, in a different part of his psychology, and what was visible on the surface was what remained after that processing: competence, and the specific humor of a man who is exactly where his training prepared him to be. The human cost of 9 years of British Royal Marines deployment to Afghanistan does not reduce cleanly to statistics. Any attempt to reduce it should be resisted, because statistics are a form of abstraction that the men who paid the cost, and their families, deserve not to be reduced to. But some numbers are themselves testimony to the scale of what was asked and given. Between 2001 and the end of Operation Herrick in 2014, 453 British service personnel were killed in Afghanistan. The majority of these deaths fell on the infantry units, Royal Marines, Parachute Regiment, Line Infantry, who bore the heaviest weight of the Helmand ground campaign. They died in IED strikes that dismembered rather than killed cleanly. They died in ambushes in the Green Zone. They died of wounds that trauma medicine kept survivable, but that produced outcomes. Multiple amputations, traumatic brain injuries, permanent disfigurements that constitute a different category of cost than death, but are not less severe. The Marine who loses both legs to an IED strike on a compound path is not a casualty in the abstract. He is a 22-year-old who ran 30 miles across Dartmoor in full fighting order, who passed a test that 70% of the men who attempted it failed, who is now being fitted for prosthetics in a rehabilitation center while his section is still in theater. The Corps processes this in the same register it processes everything, with dark humor, with brutal practicality, with the collective resilience that refuses to allow grief to become incapacitation. This is not callousness. It is the operational equivalent of the Commando spirit, extended into the hardest territory it faces. Not the tactical decision under fire, but the choice to continue after the loss. The families do not have the benefit of that architecture, the wives and parents and children of the men who did not come back, or who came back altered beyond easy recognition, reduced in body or changed in mind by the specific weight that too many deployments across too many years deposits in a man, bear a cost that operational records do not capture and that institutional commemoration only imperfectly acknowledges. This is not a failure unique to Britain or to the Royal Marines. It is the universal cost of sending the best into the hardest places, and it falls with a particular weight when the men who were sent were precisely the ones who passed the test that 70% could not. 6 Victoria Crosses were awarded to British servicemen during the Afghan campaign. Each citation describes an act of individual valor, the instinctive self-sacrifice, the deliberate advance into fire to cover wounded men, the continued fighting through injuries that should have ended it. The citations are written in formal military documentation language, which is itself a form of understatement, the bureaucratic register applied to the transcendent, producing a gap between the language and the reality that the reader must bridge with imagination. But the Victoria Cross represents only the visible peak of a structure whose full dimensions are not publicly documented. For every act of valor that earned formal recognition, hundreds more were witnessed and remembered and never cited, not because they were less real, but because the operational tempo of 9 years of sustained counterinsurgency generates more courage per unit time than any award system was designed to process. There are more operations in the Afghan record still partially classified, still being compiled, still held in the private memories of the men who were there, and the institutional files of a corps that takes seriously the obligation to remember. If you want to be here when we bring those accounts forward, subscribing is how you stay in that conversation. The question of why the story of Royal Marines' performance in Helmand is not more widely known has several answers that are each partially true and together constitute a complete picture. The first is operational security culture. The British military's tradition of silence about ongoing and recently concluded operations is structural, rooted in institutional values that predate the modern media environment, and that the Royal Marines specifically exemplify. The Commando ethos does not include self-promotion. The man who passes the Green Beret course is not encouraged to write a book about it. He is encouraged to get on with the work. The operational record of the Corps across decades of conflict is held not in published memoirs and documentary films, but in classified after-action reports and the private memories of the men who were there. This serves operational security. It also produces a significant asymmetry between forces whose culture permits and encourages public storytelling and forces whose culture treats public storytelling as a form of operational risk. The second answer is the structural dominance of the American military in the English-language media ecosystem. Hollywood makes films about American military operations because Hollywood is an American industry serving an American primary audience with a financial incentive to tell stories of American excellence. This is not a conspiracy. It is a market outcome. The consequence is that operations like Operation Red Wings receive global cinematic treatment and cultural permanence, while operations of comparable complexity and cost conducted by British units in the same theatre receive brief broadsheet coverage that disappears from the public record within weeks. This is not an argument that those American stories don't deserve their place. It is an observation that the record is systematically incomplete, and that the incompleteness serves a market logic rather than a historical one. The third answer is more uncomfortable. The British political class across the period of the Afghan commitment had institutional reasons to manage public awareness of the scale and cost of the operation in ways that did not serve honest public understanding. A deployment entered with the expectation of limited combat and exited after 453 deaths is a deployment whose political management requires a specific kind of narrative handling, one that emphasizes progress and partnership rather than the grinding, costly, tactically distinguished but strategically ambiguous reality that the operational record actually describes. The extraordinary performance of Royal Marines in Helmand was real. It was also, from a political perspective, difficult to celebrate loudly without simultaneously inviting the question of what it was in service of. The operational record does not require political validation. The men who fought in Helmand do not require the approval of institutions that struggled to give them adequate body armor. Their performance is documented in the after-action assessments of their allies, in the accounts of the journalists who were there, in the testimony of their enemies, and in the institutional memory of a corps that has been producing this kind of human being for 350 years, and that will continue producing them regardless of whether the achievement is publicly acknowledged. The Commando course at Limestone runs today. The 32 weeks are the same 32 weeks they have always been. The Dartmoor moors are the same moors. The rain is the same rain. The pass rate has not been adjusted upward to make the math more comfortable for a recruiting audience. The 30-miler is still 30 miles, still 8 hours, still in full fighting order, still in the kind of weather that the Devon coast generates, with indifference to the plans of military training establishments. Every morning at CTCRM Limestone, a new cohort of potential commandos faces the same calculation that every Royal Marine going back to 1664 has faced: whether the thing they are being asked to do exceeds the thing they came here to become. Most conclude, at some point in those 32 weeks, that it does. They leave. They are not lesser men for leaving. They encountered the real boundary of their capacity at that moment, and the course is designed to find that boundary because the boundary is the information. The men who do not leave, the 25 to 30% who arrive at the final week, who carry 30 miles in 8 hours across the moors, who stand at the end of the process having been rebuilt at a level below conscious awareness, these men are the answer to the question the American officer was asking when he watched 8 of them do what his company could not. They are not carrying better rifles. They are not operating from better intelligence or better close air support integration or a more sophisticated tactical doctrine. They are carrying something that has no weight in a Bergen but that governs every decision made under pressure. The thing the course puts inside the man in Devon before Afghanistan is anything more than a name on a map. Next time you hear a conversation about which nation produces the standard that others aspire to, about where the doctrine came from, which force set the ceiling, remember what the American officer said when he watched 8 Royal Marines walk out of the dark in Helmand and accomplish what a company could not. Remember that his statement was not admiration for a more powerful force. It was the specific admission of a professional who recognized, in another professional, a standard he had not known to expect, a standard that arrived not with GPS coordinates or precision munitions or a quick reaction force on standby, but with a Bergen, a compass, a green beret, and 32 weeks of something that 70% of the men who tried it could not survive. The work speaks. The professionals don't. The Royal Marines Commando is a small green beret on a man who earned it the hardest way available in peacetime. What it means is that the calculation about stopping has already been made. What it means is that the enemy is about to encounter the most expensive form of underestimation. What it means is that you do not mistake the silence for the absence of the weapon.